This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. That's AASA. ASA is a fantastic organisation that exists for the purpose of supporting animal studies scholars. They work really hard to make life fabulous for people engaged in the practice of academic study of animals, and also they do a lot of work with artists as well. And I'm sure there are quite a few activists in among their membership. So if you're not a member of AASA, ASA, think about joining them. That's the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Membership is extremely reasonably priced. And indeed, our guest today is a member of ASA, a proud member of ASA, I'm sure, as am I. Now, this episode is also brought to you by the wonderful people at Sydney University Press, and they have a special section of their press that's called Animal Publics that focuses on publishing books about animal studies, animal issues, and indeed the book that we are discussing today is part of the Sydney University Press Animal Publics series. So that makes this episode even more special. Now, before we go any further and I introduce you to our guest, I also wanted to do something that I haven't been doing on these episodes, but I think I should have been doing, and I feel as though I was doing the wrong thing and I want to try to do better. So I want to acknowledge that I'm recording this episode on Aboriginal land, Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to any First Nations people that might be listening. Okay, now let's find out who our guest is, even though I know you know because you've already seen the cover of the podcast episode. So this week we're joined by Dr. Rowena Lennox. Now we're going to discuss Rowena's book, Dingo Bold, The Life and Death of Gari Dingoes, which was published, as we just heard, by Sydney University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Rowena.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Okay, Rowena, what inspired this book?
Oh, well, before I talk about my inspiration, I too would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal custodians of the land where I live and work. That's the Dharawal people, and also the Bachelor and the Gubbi Gubbi people from Gari and the Cooloola Coast, who are the custodians of the land where I did the research for this book.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Rowena.
Oh, thanks. And I thank you too for doing such a wonderful job of thanking Sydney Uni Press and ASA, without whom this book wouldn't exist. But my initial inspiration was my dog Zephyr, and I was fascinated by how she was such a cooperative member of our family, but also how she had her dog instincts and perceptions and preferences, and I wanted to write about her. Around that time, and it was a number of years ago now, Voiceless, the animal charity, were running an essay competition. And to enter the competition, you had to write about a factory farm animal or you had to write about an Australian native animal. So I expanded my essay about Zephyr to Dingoes, which is a form of canid family history, really. And Dingoes are really inspiring because they're beautiful and amazing, and sometimes scary, but they're also persecuted by humans across much of Australia, and they're also loved by humans. Also, it's interesting that dingoes haven't really featured much in Australian literature or cultural production. There was a novel published in the 1940s by Frank W. Davison about a dingo-kelpie cross called Dusty. And more recently, there was a female dingo in a book by Stephen Daisley called Coming Rain. They're both novels. There's been some great dingo characters recently. Bruce Pascoe's novella Fogger Docks has a beautiful dingo character called Brim, And of course, Laura Jean Mackay's The Animals in That Country has Sue the dingo. Non-fiction about dingoes has tended to be more for a specialist audience. Bradley Smith's The Dingo Debate and Brad Purcell's Dingo are both really for more scientific audiences, I think. Similarly, Laurie Corbett's 1995 book, The Dingo in Australia and Asia, it's again more for a scientific audience. Jennifer Parkhurst, one of the people I interviewed for Dingo Bold, published a beautiful book about the dingo life cycles on Gari, and along with that, her very intimate photographs of dingoes. And then the most comprehensive and sympathetic book about dingoes for a general audience was published in 1988. It's by Roland Breckwalt, and it's called A Very Elegant Animal, the Dingo. And it brings in historical and cultural perspectives, including dingoes' relationships with First Nations people. So there's been a lot more research since 1988 and a growing awareness of the importance of dingoes' relationships with Aboriginal people. So I thought there was a need for a book about dingoes that thought expansively about them. You know, why do we persecute them? Why can't we fit them into the categories that we usually think about Australian animals in? You know, invasive or native, or introduced or native, tame or wild. You know, they didn't seem to fit. And I thought Gari was only going to be one part of this book. I visited the island and the Kulula coast to interview people, and those interviews appear in the book because people don't agree about dingo management on the island. It's very hard to bring the different viewpoints together. It's often quite combative, and there was a lot of sort of bad blood, really, between the people who'd been involved with dingoes there. On my first research trip to the island, I met a dingo. Jennifer Parkhurst and I watched two young male dingoes walking down the beach, and we nicknamed one of them Bold because he walked so close to a guy who was collecting pippies in the sand. Later, when I got out of the car, this dingo came up to me. He came up to me, he looked at me in the face, he walked around me, he came back to me, he looked at me in the face again, and then he walked away of his own accord. So the encounter lasted a minute, and Jennifer Parkhurst photographed all of it. It was boring. I was boring. The encounter was uneventful, but as he approached me, I could feel the blood at the back of my head thumping, and I could feel my skin breaking out in a cold sweat. And later, I sort of played through that encounter again in my mind, and as I learnt more about dingo behaviour on Gari, I realised that there were all sorts of unconscious negotiations going on, very, split-second negotiations that I wasn't completely aware of that were going on during that interaction between us. 3 months later, I found out that Bold had been killed by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service rangers because he was deemed to pose a safety risk to people. Parks keep interaction reports about the dingoes who have interactions with people, so they had heaps of data on Bold. I was able to reconstruct his life, and I wanted to give him his life back in a way. I thought a lot about his family, his brother who'd been travelling with him down the beach that day, and his mother who I saw on a subsequent visit to the island. Dingoes usually live in these cooperative, communicative, sociable family groups, and so I wondered how his death had affected that family. It's usually the young male dingoes who are killed because they are deemed to pose a safety risk to people, and I wondered how that affected the families. So this book has a personal thread through it because I was aware that my reactions to my interaction with Bold and to the other research that I was doing were affected by my own background and experiences. Bold's story felt quite personal for me because my two brothers both died when they were relatively young, and my mum died while I was writing this book. So she'd always been one of my first readers, and it was a big loss in so many ways.
Yeah, Rowena, I can remember your mum's passing. I'm so sorry. And yeah, it's so connected to the book, but please don't let me interrupt you. Keep going.
No, well, that's so I guess it was this confluence of all these things that gave me the inspiration for Dingo Bold.
Yeah. Rowena, that's lovely. I have so many questions for you, and I also want to say that I absolutely adored the book. It is this really fabulous mode of conveying information about non-human animals that I'm absolutely loving, where it's not kind of dry, turgid academic, journal article writing. It's informative, but it is also a story. It's your story and it's a dingo story, and you get swept up in it. So I really commend the book to listeners. And as I always say, if you can't afford to buy a copy for yourself, please order one for your library. And this is the kind of book that I think would be fabulous at a university library, but also a local library. Like, it's for everybody, really. Now, I've got so much I want to ask you, but can we take a step back and can you tell us, for perhaps the benefit of international listeners, but even perhaps for the benefit of local listeners, who or what is a dingo?
Yeah, well, people have been arguing about that for a long time. Dingoes are mysterious canids. They're part of the canid family, which includes dogs and includes wolves. And they've lived in isolation in Australia for several thousand years. Nobody's exactly sure how long they've been here. The archaeological evidence puts it at least 3,500. The genetic evidence sort of pushes that out, perhaps as far as 18,000 years. Nobody knows how they got here, so there's theories about them coming with seafarers on vessels to the north of Australia, and possibly being semi-domesticated animals and being brought as food for the voyage. There are other theories that they may have walked here when Australia was part of the Sahul continent, when the last ice age, the sea levels were lower during the last ice age. There's been no evidence of dingoes found on Tasmania or Kangaroo Island or the Bass Strait Islands, so it's believed that they didn't get that far south, while Tasmania was attached to the mainland.
Mm. And so dingoes, as you pointed out in your introduction and as you discussed at length in the book, they have this really complex, contradictory, multifaceted kind of place in Australian culture and landscape and all the rest, just in so many different ways. So can you tell us a little bit about their life on Fraser Island and why that is a particular site of contestation around dingoes? Can you paint a bit of a picture of that environment?
Yeah. So, well, to start with, on the continent, they're killed because they prey on sheep. But then more recent studies sort of pose that they're actually beneficial to ecosystems because they're an apex predator, and so they eat the kangaroos who graze on the grass, so that there's more grass available for cattle, for example. So they even, this dichotomous thinking around them even goes to quite scientific research on them. Are they a gory predator, a pest, or are they an ecological saviour kind of thing? So on the mainland, they're persecuted. They're meant to be protected in some national parks. Now, Gari's a World Heritage Area. It's the biggest sand island in the world. It's an astonishingly beautiful place with fresh water, loads of fresh water, lakes, streams. Rainforest grows out of the sand. You wouldn't believe it. It has to be real because nobody could have made it up, kind of thing. And dingoes live there. Dingoes have lived there with Aboriginal people. I mean, the notorious shipwreck of the Stirling Castle, the Eliza Fraser stories, in in the 1830s, a ship was wrecked. The survivors made it to Gari and lived with the Bachelor Aboriginal people for about 6 weeks over the winter. The survivors' accounts mention dingoes and their relationships with the Aboriginal people on Gari. And when you scour the sources, you can find dingoes sort of everywhere in those early contact narratives. Now Dingoes, the World Heritage Area, it's mostly managed by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. The policies around dingoes have changed, say since the 1990s when it became World Heritage listed. Previously, Fraser Island was managed by forestry, and dingoes were people were encouraged to feed them. Apparently, people wormed dingoes and they lived around townships and houses and had very close relationships with people. Changes in sort of the management were coming in through the 90s. People were discouraged from feeding them. And then a young boy was mauled to death by 2 dingoes in 2001, which was a real tragedy. He was out walking with another young boy, and the other young boy made it back to camp, but Clinton Gage, who was 9 years old, was killed. And that really precipitated, the different management structures had been in place, but that really precipitated the enforcing of separation, the attempt to separate people from dingoes, to enforce prohibitions on feeding them, to sort of increase the incident reporting and to really, make it more very systematic about incidents are coded according to their levels of severity and so on. I heard about the story of Jennifer Parkhurst, who was fined for feeding dingoes. She went there and started observing them. She had permission to photograph them and observe them, and she became very close to a particular female dingo and a particular pack of dingoes. And she was very critical of parks management practices. She thought they were killing dingoes unnecessarily. She thought that some of the practices were cruel and hampered dingoes' ability to hunt, such as the practice of ear tagging dingoes when they were quite young, and she thought it affected their hearing. They did use methods such as hazing, which is shooting them with pellets out of a slingshot to try and deter them from going near people. Parks' management practices based on this idea that dingoes are naturally wild and naturally afraid of people. Clearly, Bold wasn't afraid of people, but Parks would have explained his behaviour by saying that he had been habituated with food. He had been drawn to people with food from a very young age. So even though his brother, who was born at the same time, same place, same parents, same everything, was much more timid and did not approach me on the beach and was not a problem dingo in the same way that Bold was. So Parks say their management is to sort of reinstitute this naturally wild nature of dingoes, which is it's like doing somersaults, some kind of contortions sometimes, because clearly some dingoes are more interested in people than others. Some dingoes approach people, like even Bold and his brother, that little tiny experiment there, his brother didn't approach, Bold did, sort of thing, even though they'd had the same environment. So now they try and stop people from feeding dingoes and from interacting with them.
And how kind of successful is that? Because the sense I get from your book and from hearing you speak now is that it is a really divided community. And, how successful are the management practices at this time?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on who you talk to. Jennifer Parkhurst was devastated because she was watching dingoes die of starvation. And Parks would say if a pair of dingoes has 10 pups in a litter, not all of them are going to survive. Some of them are going to die. That's just the way it goes. They're very different outlooks on our relationships with animals, aren't they? And you'd see it echoed in discussions about setting up wildlife hospitals on the island, and how much people should intervene. Parks I do think parks are trying not to kill dingoes. For several years, say from 2001 to about 2013, I mean, when you looked at the numbers, you know, a big proportion of the population were killed every year. And, you know, they had sort of, the scientific experts would say, well, you know, this is not going to affect the population because they're only the young males, they don't breed, this and that. You know, after Clinton Gage was killed, about 30 dingoes were killed, just, you know, taken out in different places where dingoes were very used to people, where dingoes lived under the verandas or where dingoes... so they've fenced the townships so that the dingoes can't, you know, are not meant to be able to get into the townships. I mean, some of them do. Bold did. Bold got through fences to do whatever it was. He wanted to go to the pub on State of Origin night, you know. He kind of,
don't we all?
He did that. But yeah, and like there, you know, 2 or 3 incidents reported a year. The latest that I've seen are they put cameras on the dingoes, which are quite heavy and, you know, would impede their movement, I think. I mean, the footage is incredible that you get. It's this awful situation because you see this really interesting footage. You think, no, this is wrong. These dingoes, these cameras shouldn't be there. But then you see this footage of a dingo's eye perspective or a dingo's neck's perspective, which one of the most fascinating things about it that I found was that there was always another dingo in the shot. There was either a paw, you know, a paw in the den in the morning or you know, a tail or, you know, a bit of fur, you know, so that they're sort of part of this group, you know, they have individual reactions and responses, but they're always part of this group. And it's parks. I don't think the rangers I spoke to wanted to kill dingoes, but they sort of, because of the mindset, they regarded it as necessary. They probably would like more controlled tourism on the island. They found that it was easier to talk to tour operators than to free and independent travellers. You know, they feel like they don't have enough resources to go out and tell everybody every morning at all the campsites not to interact with dingoes. You know, they can't. Yeah, it's a big island, 180,000 hectares or something. You know, they can't be everywhere. So I found that they were between a rock and a hard place, really.
Yeah, Rowena, you raise a lot of really tricky and complex ethical issues in the book, and, you know, also they come to mind hearing you talk now. Have you thought about your role as a researcher and how you impact on the ecosystem of the dogs and, you know, what that means for them to be observed by you and written about by you?
Wow.
It's a difficult question.
I hope it helps them. I wanted to try and come in, and again, you travel on the island in a 4-wheel drive. You know, you drive up that beach, which is their territory, and it's gazetted as a road. And, you know, a dingo goes on the road. You know, for the dingo, it's a beach, but it's the road. So, yeah, I'm complicit with all the terrible things that are happening when humans encroach on animals' habitats. It's hard to get to the island. You know, like I flew there and you land on the plane on the runway, which is the beach, which is the road. I did want to come in with trying to not be in an entrenched position. I had a great sympathy for the dingoes. I had sadness about the prosecution of Jennifer Parkhurst. I had great sadness for the sort of the dingo deaths that she'd witnessed. I guess I came in with a I suppose an anti-authoritarian streak as well, because I feel like sometimes islands are managed. Their managers kind of function with impunity, like they can do anything they like. They're sort of little realms of their own. And I found some parallels because I've written before about East Timor. I mean, and it might seem that they're totally different subjects, but they're both quite politically intriguing, and they're both islands. So there were some parallels there, and the way authority is used, and how you interact with authority, really, whether authority can listen to people. And I wanted to sort of try and put a dingo's interests into the picture, because it's a lot about people. When you hear about Gari, you know, they had the devastating fires there in 2020 that burnt half the island, and when you heard people talking about it afterwards, it was all open for business. It was like the fire, all the bushes coming back, and we can go there, and it wasn't like, is there food there? What's been the effect on the insect life? How, are there any resources to do research on the animals? No, it was all just like, get back there, have fun, enjoy it, sort of thing.
Rowena, did you find that your view changed during the process of preparing for the book? Did you perhaps see it as a more complicated issue than you imagined, or did the research kind of confirm your intuitions going into it?
Both, really, if I can say that. I know the day after I met Bold, at that stage I hadn't been successful in getting permission to interview any rangers. And so Bold came up to me, totally uneventful, but still I had this visceral reaction. And I sort of woke up and thought, how could I go there with my daughter, who was about 7 or 8 at the time? I don't think I could. I don't think I'd take my young child there. And I need to talk to a ranger. I need to get their perspective on this, because there was a dingo so free. How can they keep them separate? How can they keep people and dingoes separate?
Fascinating. Now, listeners might be able to hear some noise in the background. One of my cats, Tom Tom, is extremely naughty, and he's being extra naughty, perhaps showing off for Rowena, because Rowena was with me at the time that Tom Tom was being named and was coming into my life, and now he's putting on a display. So my apologies if you can hear Tom Tom in the background. Now, Rowena, we ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer quick questions. You, of course, are a return guest, so for you it's 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Yep.
Okay. What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
Oh, I like the expansiveness of it. I feel like it offers new ways of thinking and new ways of looking at things. Thinking about animals' perspectives is very mind-broadening, really. I really like the people I've met. I wrote about Dingo Bold as part of a doctorate of creative arts, so I got to go to conferences and symposiums and things, and I did, in creative writing and in history, but it was the animal studies groups, reading groups and so on, and conferences where I felt I'd really come home. And as you were talking about ASA, it's political, and they're not afraid to acknowledge that. And of course, research is political, and art and activism are really important, and that's so refreshing. And also, I just love thinking about animals, watching animals, observing animals, researching them.
Yeah, wonderful. Actually, Rowena, I hadn't completely realised that this was your PhD, or an earlier iteration had been your PhD. How marvellous. That's wonderful. Okay, what's the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I guess learning about the cruelty inflicted by humans on animals is heartbreaking, and seeing the utter disregard that many humans have for animals when we destroy their habitats and, use them as commodities. The general apathy about animal issues is very disheartening in academia and in wider society. Wouldn't be telling you anything there, would I, Siobhan?
Yeah, I am really interested in people's responses, because, there are so many different things you could say, but yes, I do agree with you, absolutely. Okay, now this is your opportunity to give a shout out to an animal studies scholar that you think perhaps might have been overlooked by listeners. So this could be somebody who's an emerging scholar, or it could be somebody who is working in an allied field but not perhaps necessarily right in the centre of animal studies. It could also be someone writing in a language other than English. Who do you want to give your shout out to?
Well, can I tell you about a few things that I've read lately?
Sure, there are a lot of people that blatantly ignore my directive to name one person or one thing.
Well, I just want to tell you about a few things that have helped me recently.
Sure.
Paula Akari's article, The COVID Pandemic, Pivotal Moments and Persistent Anthropocentrism, really seems to bring together all the arguments about, that we know, humans know that, commodification of animals and habitat destruction has led to COVID, but yet we continue to do nothing about it. So that appeared in Animal Studies Journal this year. David Brooks is writing on kangaroos. He's got an article in Animal Studies Journal, I think it was last year, on the grieving kangaroo photograph revisited. And, it's his signature beautiful writing style that, argued really well. I've listened to Sue Pike, who's a scholar in Melbourne, on snakes. And I quickly looked, she's published on snakes, but and just certain things she said about, snakes that we sort of condone, snakes wrapped up in little boxes, that's all right kind of thing, and which, is very illuminating. I'm reading Taya Brooks-Priback's book about animal grief and spirituality, Enter the Animal, at the moment, also published by Sydney University Press. And if I could just give a shout out to Franz Kafka's long short story called Investigations of a Dog, about dog domestication from a dog's point of view. That I found that really, it's got boring bits. It's a long short story. It was written in the early part of the 20th century. Nobody's got that attention span anymore. But it just seemed to offer some really interesting takes on.
Wonderful. Well, you're clearly an avid reader. That's a wonderful list for everyone to go on with, particularly for people who are in a bit of a restricted situation due to COVID. And a big shout out to Sue. I'm working with Sue at the moment on a project, and she's extremely patient. As a result, she has to be. Final question: are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relationships?
Oh, yes and no. Talk to me at 4 a.m, or talk to the public face. We seem hell-bent on extracting profits from the earth, and animals continue to be commodified and their interests ignored, as if humans' idiocy knows no bounds. But there's also increasing awareness about the terrible effects of habitat destruction and factory farming. And, I have great hopes. It might feel like a bit of a cop-out to say, but young people, but young people are quite aware, and veganism and plant-based diets are not sort of such an outlier as they might have been 20 years ago. So, again, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Rowena, what are you working on next?
Oh, well, I continue to write about dingoes. I've worked with Fiona Probyn-Rapsey on a couple of articles about dingoes on Pelorus Island in the Great Barrier Reef, who were used to eradicate goats. They were implanted with poison capsules and were used to eradicate goats. Yeah. So the first one of that's out in a geography journal, and the next article about carceral colonialism and dingoes and tourism, conservation and tourism, is coming out in about a month.
So, Rowena, can I interrupt you? Just to be clear, if I understood correctly, that they were put there to eradicate the goats, but they had embedded in them poison that would kill them once they finished that task on our behalf.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Yeah, that's pretty manipulative, really.
This stuff. It's shocking.
Yeah.
The implants didn't work.
Okay, great.
But I don't know what happened, to the dingoes, but they did live on longer than their designated time.
Okay.
Oh,
very exploitative. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
Yes.
What else are you working on?
Yeah, I've been thinking about dingoes and decolonisation because, I learned that it's impossible to think about dingoes without thinking about their relationships with First Nations people. So that's opened up my eyes, I guess, to so much epistemic injustice when, Aboriginals people's testimony about dingoes, for example, in the Azaria Chamberlain case, when, the Aboriginal trackers' evidence was not really given the
weight.
Yeah, that it should have been. And so, yeah, I've got something coming out in a book called Decolonising Animals, which is sort of reading Europeans' accounts of Aboriginal dingoes and, trying to learn more about Aboriginal culture from that perspective. And I'll continue to think about dingoes, I guess, as subjects of colonisation and agents of decolonisation, and about their relationships with humans and country.
Wonderful. Well, that sounds like fabulous work, Rowena. How can people find you?
They can look for me on my academia page. That's got a good selection of creative work and academic work. And I mean, if they Google me, they might find some of my online stuff that isn't on my academia page.
Yeah, you've got a great Insta account where
Oh,
your
yeah,
book pops
Insta.
up
Thanks,
lots of
Siobhan.
places.
Yeah. So that's Rowena.Lennox, my Insta handle. I mean, they can find Dingo Bold at the University of Sydney website or Booktopia, or, if they're really keen, they could ask their bookshop to order it in.
Absolutely, and order a copy for their library while they're at it. Well, Rowena, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Siobhan.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. And we're also all over the socials, Twitter at knowing_animals. I'm at SO_S. We've got a Facebook page, so we're all over the shop. And don't forget that if you'd like to support the podcast, you can leave a review on whatever app you're listening to this on, because reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. Well, that's all for this round. Thank you so much. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.